Howdy folks. So I know it's been a while since I've done a video, but I just wanted to get the stock dimensions and measurements of this knife on record before I go and regrind it. So in front of you we have the newly released Spyderco Manix 2 Sprint Run in CPM-15V steel. Now this Sprint Run was a collaboration between Spyderco and Sean Houston, also known as Triple B, whose logo is here on the back. And from what Sean posted, the final hardness on these is about 65 HRC, at least on the model he tested. So one of my biggest complaints about Spyderco, at least the golden Colorado made ones, is they're generally quite thick behind the edge. So I generally regrind them when I get them to make them more pleasant to use and sharpen and so on. Now this does limit the scope of use, so you're going to have to be much more careful with the knife. You don't let other people use it, that kind of thing. But I wanted to go over the stock dimensions of this before I regrind it. So the edge here, so it's 25 thou thick at the base. The majority of the edge is about 28 thou thick, and then it's 31 thou at the tip. So the stock sharpening angle is between 15 and 16 degrees per side, with a very noticeable micro bevel here on the presentation side. It has been asymmetrically sharpened. I'm sure not by design, but so here in the middle, the majority of the bevels, the width on the presentation side is 73 thou wide, and the width on the non-presentation side is 35 thou wide. So the presentation side's bevel is a little over twice as wide as the non-presentation side. So that's going to be fun during the regrind. I typically like to use the edge as the center line when I do a regrind, so I make sure that my termination of the primary grind is planar. So when you sharpen it, you know, the edge ends up even and it sits level on your stone and doesn't have any, you know, inconsistencies along its length. Generally when they're uneven, I sharpen them when I first get them to make the regrinds easier, but in a high wear resistant steel like this that's also not cheap, probably not going to do a preliminary sharpening. So we'll see. Now, I do completely understand why Spyderco doesn't grind these things thinner. They'd have a lot of warranty claims and disgruntled people when the people snap the tips clean off. Because, I mean, let's be honest, most people, your average everyday user, cannot handle a high alloy steel and a high hardness with a very, very lean grind. Or moreover, the knife can't handle them. So as an example of that, here is the Rex 45 Sprint Run from a couple years ago. Now I've reground this blade, so it is 7 thou at the edge till you get to the tip. It thickens up to 10 thou at the tip. And I generally regrind most of my golden Colorado Spydercos. Just makes them much more of a pleasure to use. Now this isn't the kind of knife you'd ever hand to somebody else to use, and this is why Spyderco doesn't grind them thinner. Because if you look at that tip, it's not going to take a whole lot to snap that tip clean off. So it does limit the scope of use. You've got to be more careful and diligent in your use, but it is much more pleasing to use a knife that is designed or reground for performance like this one. So this is about a 220 grit belt finish. You can actually, if you look hard, you can see the carbide stringers. Because this run was run about 67 HRC, you get kind of a burnishing effect when you go up to higher grits on the grinding belts. And when you kind of burnish it, you get the carbide stringers. So they're little bands of lines going like that across the length of the blade. Kind of looks like streaks. I've also crowned the spine for the majority of its length to make it more comfortable to use. In addition to that, I have rounded all the edges on the G10. Now that makes a huge difference of comfort in hand when you do that little bit of work. Also, lapped, flat, and polished the blade tang, so it has a much smoother, more polished contact surface with the phosphor bronze washers and the pivot, so it is a lot smoother. Blade centering on this bad boy is dead center. So Spyderco has actually done a pretty good job on the Manixes in the past few years compared to those produced, 7-8 years ago. Blade centering on this one is pretty much dead center too. So from the factory, they just barely bevel, put a 45-degree chamfer on that corner to break that sharp edge to make it a little bit more comfortable, but rounding it makes it so much more comfortable in hand. Aside from the edge thickness and all that, really my only other concern is, this is quite late lockup. You don't have a whole lot of room for wear and break in there, so it hasn't been a problem on my Manixes in the past, but we'll see. This is a hard steel, and you got a hardened ball bearing, which you can also replace with ceramic, so I wouldn't think it'd be too big of an issue, but if you're the kind of person that really beats on your knives, you might have an issue with that. Was glad to see that Spyderco did stonewash the finish, which means I'm not going to have to lap, flat, and polish the contact surfaces here in the pivot because it's already fairly smooth. So there it is. I will do an update when I regrind it, so stay tuned for that. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and I will see y'all soon.